Okay, let's start. Welcome everybody to this webinar from ATA on the opportunity of clean energy trade across the Mediterranean. First, let me express my hope that everybody is staying safe in these difficult times, but also to wish you happy Earth Day. Today is Earth Day 2020, very appropriate for the topic of the webinar. We have a great panel to present to you, but let me just review the participation because I see people introducing themselves in the chat box. Please carry on introducing yourself and saying where you're from, but we have people from a wide range of countries, from Libya and Lebanon and Albania and France and Spain and the UK and Morocco and Egypt and so on and so on. I see quite a few familiar names participating, so welcome to them and welcome to everybody. Let me briefly introduce the topic and the panel. The topic, I think, is very timely because we have not only the Green Deal in the European Union, we have the leadership of the European Union asserting again, even in these difficult COVID-19 times and whatever comes after that, that the Green Deal remains very much the framework for what the European Union does in energy. I think that automatically translates into the larger than EU space, so across the Mediterranean, utilizing the clean energy resources, the solar, the wind, and so on, where they're most efficient, where they're most abundant, where they're cheapest, including in the southern Mediterranean and the eastern Mediterranean. And we'll hear from our speakers all about the prospects for that and how to do that. As the speakers are speaking, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. So not the chat box where you've been introducing yourself, but in the Q&A box, which is next to it. Our panel today, we have, the first speaker will be Dr. Silvia Pariente-David from the Center for Mediterranean Integration and formerly of the World Bank. Then we will have Obaid Amrani from ITMAR Capital, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Morocco, and previously from the Moroccan Agency for Sustainable Energy. We'll have Cedric Philibert, who's a veteran of renewable energy, of clean energy, and formerly of the International Energy Agency. And Frank Wouters, who is currently the director of the EU GCC Energy Network, Clean Energy Network, and formerly of IRENA and of Masdar and of many other things. So let me first ask Silvia to say a few more words about herself by way of introduction, and then to proceed with her presentation. And as I said, at the end, there will be time for to answer your questions. So please send your questions through the Q&A box. Silvia, go ahead.
Screen, so I cannot put my presentation up. Can you hear me?
You're ready now, Silvia, go for it.
So it's working, everybody can see it? And everybody can
Yes,
hear
we can see it.
And I see no ding, okay. So I'll try to be, no, that doesn't work, sorry. Oh, here it is. Yeah, I'll try to be efficient because I have a lot to cover and a few minutes be given to me. And as Jonathan said, we are here today to discuss clean energy trade in the Mediterranean and how to make it possible with barriers. And probably many people are wondering why we would care right now when we're being hit by COVID and so worried about it. And there's actually a link between the two, which is what I will try to prove to you in the few minutes I have. By the way, viruses have no borders, so they can move freely around without having to worry about these barriers to trade. And they also trigger protectionist reaction, which are not very good in terms of creating a regional market. But the interlinkages between the COVID, energy, and climate are fairly complex. And COVID is, of course, a threat to our economies, our way of life, our ecosystem, etc. But it can also be an opportunity, as, of course, this confinement that results from the epidemic leads to drastic reduction on CO2 emissions, not for the good reasons. But the question now, of course, is can we do something to use this opportunity to avoid a rebound? And actually, there is a lot of analysis going around. You probably have seen some forecasting like 15% reduction in CO2 emission. And it's also resulting by default in an increasing share of renewables because the most heat forms of energy are the fossil fuels. Now, let's see what is the link with the EU Green Deal. And also, when people say we're talking about the Mediterranean, several people ask me, why do we care about the Green Deal? Number one, because many of the Mediterranean countries are also EU countries and more are trying to join. And what happens in the EU has an impact on the other countries around the sea. And that really drives a lot on the structuring of the market. And no sooner was the ambitious new EU Green Deal announced that the COVID crisis exploded. And now the Green Deal is supposed to provide the solution to get some kind of green stimulus from the induced recession. If you see what I tried to put here on this chart, a picture which comes from the European Commission, which is already complex enough by itself, but that's the way they picture the Green Deal with all these boxes. And I put around it some quotes that I've picked up over the last week or so, 10 days. Actually, I had a longer list of that. I don't expect that you will all read them in detail because it's very small print, but you can see them afterwards. But I think it's very indicative of what people think of the Green Deal right now. It's become some kind of jack of all trade, and everybody is expecting that he will be doing miracles. If I look at the description of the Green Deal by the European Commission, its president who dreamed about it, it's a new growth strategy that aims to transform the EU into a fair, prosperous society with a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy where there are no net emissions by 2050, where the environment and health of citizens are protected, and where economic growth is sustainable. It's really wonderland. And it's also aiming to do it, as we see here, through an industrial strategy for industry, but also for the energy industry. And hydrogen is figuring prominently in that industrial strategy with the launch of the Hydrogen Alliance. It has digitalization at the heart, and also making EU as the global leader in renewable energy technology. And the European Commission has launched a study with CEPS and Prognos and COWI Consult to assess the policy option for this to happen. So as far as we're concerned, and the Mediterranean, the EU, as we see here, it goes beyond energy, the EU Green Deal, it goes beyond energy and beyond the EU, because as we see from some of these boxes here, and quote from Commissioner Kadri Simon, that they expect that he will be at the heart of the external action, and particularly with the Mediterranean countries such as the Western Balkans and the Southern neighborhood. In a way, it's the EU new Marshall Plan. I think it's the people from the Delors Institute that say it's the biggest thing since the single market. Of course, it's the Delors Institute, and Delors was at the beginning of the single market. And basically, it's going to help us build a green Europe and a digital Europe, and one which will get us out of the issue with the COVID. We have the Just Transition Fund at the bottom here. You have all the financing aspect, And the Just Transition Fund specifically emphasized in the Article 4 the financing of infrastructure for affordable clean energy and greenhouse gas emission. It's also a plan, as I say, that address digital optimization, and it's been calling for response with the creation of the Green Recovery Alliance by Pascal Canfin with an MEP, and there was a letter signed by initially 10 environmental and climate ministers, and now there are 17 of them. So as you can see, it's supposed to do everything for everybody. That's also a picture that comes from the European Commission, because they have this nice sheet that describes the the energy dimension of the Green Deal. And this here, you see what they're working on to make Europe the first climate neutral continent by 2050. So in the meantime, we are in 2020. They're supposed to fix a target for 2030, which is the purpose of the climate law, which has been put on the table. And the study has been launched for an impact assessment, and some work is underway to get also, there's a consultation process underway to collect opinion on what the different countries want, what the different citizens want, what actions are needed. And all of that will be coming under some kind of legislative package. Normally the C4All legislating the energy union and climate policy between 2021 2030. So I think when the target is selected for 2030, it will have to be modified. And I've heard some places that up to 45 legislative documents are expected before the end of 2020 or beginning of 2021. And it has also been suggested that a clean energy package implementation body should be set up to handle the task. So now, if the other important point, of course, doing that is that to reach carbon neutrality, you need a massive scale up of renewable, and that goes also through electrification, direct and indirect. What I've put on this chart, on this slide, are a couple of charts that come from a recently released study by Solar Power Europe and LUT University in Finland, sorry. And basically, they tell us that it's possible to reach climate neutrality even maybe before 2050. In their leadership scenario, it would be by 2040, and then we could even reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. That requires a huge rate of electrification. Now, you could question the figure here, which is very high, but I've put in the backup slides, which I will not show, you can look at later on, other graphics, and the numbers change, but pretty much everybody agrees that you need to double the share of electricity in the energy system to be able to go carbon neutral. And in a way here, COVID might help, because it's accelerating digitalization and electrification. It also underlines how important reliable electricity supply is. We've all become addicted to our screens and webinars. And in the annex, by the way, I've put an interesting chart that shows the increase of energy consumption in the IT, ICT sector. And this is going to be huge, but we depend on all of that. And it is possible that the forced confinement might lead to a paradigm shift where we all learn to work from home and to telecommuting, and the structure of our energy consumption may change a lot. So now, why all of that we care when we're talking about Mediterranean energy trade? It's because to achieve this objective, which we saw in the various scenarios of 100% renewables for decarbonization, you need to be able to reach that 100% renewable, which means you need flexibility in your power system. And one of the best ways, in my view, the most efficient way to reach flexibility is regional market integrations through interconnectors. When you're talking about power systems, in the end, bigger is better. I also put in annex some charts that show you that it's easier to have a high penetration of renewables in a large power system. Size matters. Moreover, now, if you look at the Mediterranean, you have a picture here. The countries of the south are very rich in solar energy, and many of them are also rich in wind energy. So not only you bring flexibility, but you give Europe access to a cheap source of renewable energy. And as I said before, there are some key points of the EU Green Deal is to increase cross-border regional cooperation within Europe, but also with neighbors. So the cost comes down. And as I said, the CE for all package is the way this gets implemented. So how we do it? Well, as everybody says, oh, we don't have enough interconnectors to be able to trade. That's the limiting factor. I think it's rarely the limiting factor. What you have at the top here is the map of the Mediterranean power systems. And as you probably notice, you have no interconnection crossing the Mediterranean in the middle. It's interconnected on the two ends between Morocco and Spain, fully synchronized, and Turkey on the east, which is also fully synchronized with Europe. Some have been trying for many, many years. I worked myself on the Helmet project many times in my life. I just say a long time, many times, and it's still not happening. So it is difficult to get some new interconnectors. Europe has some ambitious targets which apply only between European countries. And even if it was extended to other countries, it may not make things a little bit easier. Now, I also put a map here of the gas, it's not the same time, the gas networks in Europe, in the Mediterranean, between Europe and the Mediterranean. And you have here some in the middle, and you have some new ones going to come to the east. But what's very interesting is that some of them have zero utilization rate, or very small. The Med gas between Spain and Algeria, there's no molecule in it. The Maghreb-Europe gas pipeline, which goes through Morocco, is the utilization has been coming down, and the Transmed as well. And I'm not even talking about the LNG terminals. So maybe we could move something else in it, especially we will hear from other speakers later that we could produce hydrogen in the southern shore, and it could be used in the mix with the gas, because at the moment we have a lot of stranded assets on the gas side. And we have a lot of tools, by the way, for financing or financial instruments to financing those interconnectors, those hardware or backbones of regional market integration, the Connecting Europe facility with the PCI. Now we have the IPECI, which is important project of European importance, something like that. And basically, you have a lot of money that's possible. So see if you're going to have use for those facilities. But it's important to make sure those infrastructures are being used, that you just don't build them because you have the money to build them. If I take an example between Greece and Italy, so there's an interconnector with no electron going on it. Or I gave the example of Med gas, where there is no molecule going through it. So having interconnectors is not enough. If I take an example of an orchestra, if you've got players and instruments, it's not enough to have a symphony. So basically, if you want to make sure you have an integrated market, you need more than just the hardware. You need them to be able to play together, and they need to have a common script or a common partition to be able to play together. And basically, all of that is going to work, what I mean, only if you think as a whole system, thinking gas and electricity together is the famous sector coupling everybody talks about. This is the new buzzword. I've also put some slides in the backup slide in the annex of what sector coupling means. And you need to think to optimize your whole system together and regionally. And I think, because I think Jonathan is going to be very upset with me, I'm going to run out of time. I will let the conclusion, I think, for the end of our webinar, when we're going to have more presentation on especially the hydrogen dimension. But basically, everything I said here is pointing towards saying it's the right time to launch a big initiative around hydrogen in the Mediterranean that will serve the markets In Europe, we have a lot of cheap energy, cheap renewables, I mean, and we need, of course, to have the infrastructure. It could be something like the new Airbus of Europe. But what matters is flexibility, integration, whole system approach, not just electricity. Thank you very much for your attention. I guess we'll take the question afterwards.
Hey, thank you very much, Sylvia, for a very good summary of the Green Deal and some of the opportunities that are coming from the Green Deal. I see that quite a lot of questions are coming in. We have more than 200 participants, and quite a few people have put questions in the Q&A box. I would encourage more questions. Any questions you want to ask during the course of the presentations, please put them in the Q&A box. Let me pass now to Obaid Amrani from ITMAR in Morocco, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Morocco. Obaid, if you'd like to say a few words of introduction of yourself and then carry on with your presentation.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to everybody in the panel. And I hope that all the attendees are well, and I hope them good health in this period of COVID-19. I'm here to speak about two things. First one is what is the Sustainable Electricity Trade Roadmap Initiative, and to speak what could be the next step in regarding the impact of the COVID-19 on not only electricity, but also in terms of integration on the region. So Sylvia, when you spoke about Airbus European, I think that you have to broaden your perspective. We are here to talk how new space like the Mediterranean European region can construct a more resilient and sustainable economies post-COVID-19. And this is the issue. I think that in this dimension, in the set roadmap, we go from some background that's regional electricity market integration are key in achieving decarbonization of the power sector as required to achieve the objective of the Paris Agreement. Moreover, we believe that the regional electricity market integration results in investment and operating cost savings and contribute to power system flexibility through load aggregation and reserves sharing. From that, we gone with 4 European countries plus Morocco that has been followed by the Union of Mediterranean and the European Commission, and with the help of the World Bank, into a dynamic to see and to analyze what could be the net benefits of increasing renewable electricity exchange between the south and the north of Europe, resulting in electricity market integration. And we try to identify investments and the regulatory or legal changes that should be taken and process and procedures to enable free, sustainable trade between the 5 countries. For that, we get 2 major joint declarations that has been made by the government. The first one was in November 2016 in the COP22, where France, Germany, Morocco, Portugal, and Spain announces their volunteer to develop the roadmap and to exchange renewable electricity. The work has been done, and in December 2018 in Brussels, those countries announces a new joint declaration where they agreed to focus in the short term on establishing an open and free cross-border green corporate PPA market while initiating action for electricity market integration. So what was the result? The results of the cost and benefit analysis give us that the electricity market integration between the 5 countries has significant benefit for all the countries. And I insist here for all the countries to meet their demand at the lower cost, to develop the renewable potential of all the countries, and using resource where they are the best, to reduce CO emission and to reserve sharing and more efficient use of flexibility solution. So the electricity market integration, we demonstrate that this electricity market integration will allow for the integration of renewables, enables fuel economy and operational cost reduction, all thanks to a better use of existing assets, a more efficient use of flexible solutions. The interconnection will reduce the needs for other flexibility measures and for more investment. The electricity market integration will allow for better tap into renewable energy resource in all the 5 countries to develop a more significant energy market capacity and produce more electricity from renewable energy resources. Operational costs are also reduced thanks to the better use of existing assets, and access to cheaper flexibility solution allow for more renewable energy to be deployed. So with that, what can we, when we come today and we see what are the impact of the COVID-19, and this is something that is shared by all the majority of economists, is that the world will not be the same, and we will assist to a new paradigms into infrastructure and into logistical new reshape in all the industry. We will not, I think that the world will not make the mistake to depend from one region and should go moreover in some nearshore strategies. And here where we have the connection between the set roadmap, which can create a good opportunity to foster its implementation and to enlarge it to more and more molecule or elements that can take advantage from the big potential of renewable energy that is into the south of the Mediterranean, but also to hurry up and to foster the realization of the objective of the reducing of CO into the European industrial sectors by the 2015. We all know that the electricity will be the second position after efficiency that will contribute to the reduction of CO into industry. And electrification that is foreseen by some studies is expect that European countries will need for their industry to be decarbonized between 2,000 and 4,000 gigawatt of new capacity of renewable energy. So this creates a very, even if it is a hypothesis, creates a very good opportunity and potential to deeper the integration between the north and the south in Mediterranean regarding the exchange of not only of electricity, but high rich molecule that are incorporating renewable energy to be green stamped. And those elements can be considered into several industrial pathways that are already identified. And we think that it is time for industrial players to go into these schemes and these strategies to start developing some real new assets that are today almost at the market. One of these elements I think will be shared by the next speakers. I can say only one of the most advanced here, which is related to hydrogen or some new renewable energy fuels or green fuels that are under development into Morocco. And those elements can be also shared on the Q&A session. So just to respect my time that was imposed to me, I just want to say that the COVID-19 should be for us a great opportunity to see how we can improve the whole integration, not only in Europe between the European countries, but also into the South with the Mediterranean region, that we should go very fast. We should be in a path where we can move fast to identify all the potential sectors that can benefit either from the capacities of the renewable energy that exist in the South, and to meet the need for decarbonization of industries in the North, and to create a more resilient and a more sufficient sub-sectors between the Americas, the Europe, the Mediterranean region, and the Asian region. So with those remarks, I close my quotes, and I'm here, will be happy to give any answer to or any comment that can be raised from the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Obaid. Thank you for a great summary of opportunities and for a summary of what Morocco and various European countries have been doing to open up renewable energy trade between them. I think one question that is running through the Q&A box, and I'm seeing a lot of Q&A questions coming in, and I would encourage more. But one question running through the Q&A box and through the presentations that we've had so far from Sylvia and from Obaid is what happens after the COVID-19 crisis, and when we get into the prolonged economic crisis, the economic depression that many people are expecting will come, and then the recovery period. What happens about energy? Does a economically depressed Europe want the cheapest energy? In which case, will it open up its markets to importing that cheapest energy from North Africa, where the solar and wind resource is so great and the land is available and all the rest of it? Or will a depressed Europe turn inward on itself, in which case maybe it stays depressed for longer? What would be the consequences for the Mediterranean as a whole if the economic opportunities are shared across the Mediterranean instead of being kept within Europe? We've seen what happens in the last few years when that's the case. Will that change after COVID? Will there be more vision, more leadership, more openness across the Mediterranean? Let me now turn to Cédric Philibert, who will briefly introduce himself, and then Cédric, if you could carry on with your presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan, and thanks, Sylvia, for laying the ground, and thanks to Obaid for having spoken mostly on electricity trade, because electricity, of course, will be from renewables, will be the backbone of decarbonization of our economies. I will focus my talk on hydrogen. Oops, somebody else is still sharing a screen. Maybe that's Obaid, and then I cannot share mine.
I don't know how to.
You have to end the sharing somewhere.
At the top.
At the top. Done. Excuse me.
That's okay. And I think now you can share you can see my screen. My title, in a way, says it all, because I'm not speaking about green hydrogen trade opportunities, but green hydrogen-rich feedstocks and fuels global trade opportunities. And I think this is the essence of my message today, because hydrogen is not that easy to trade, while hydrogen-rich fuels and feedstock are much easier to ship and store. But first, hydrogen to doing what? I think it's important to have a good idea of that. Today, hydrogen is being made from fossil fuels, and it's being used to make ammonia and to make methanol for industrial uses, with fertilizers and chemicals, and also to clean and upgrade our fuels, fossil fuels in refineries. And of course, these uses have to be decarbonized. The market for hydrogen is already here. It's 70 million tons of pure hydrogen plus 40 million tons of mixed hydrogen in mix. So it's quite important. The next step is probably to use hydrogen to make direct reduction of iron ores in steel making, and this is a challenge at in the long term, more than 3 billion tons of CO2 if we can go this road, which is shown here with the hybrid project. It's called the electric roads. It already exists, but with hydrogen from natural gas, and the idea is to make it with hydrogen from renewables, from water electrolysis, and then to reduce the iron ores and then send it to electric arc furnaces where they will be turned into steel. So we could have near zero carbon dioxide steel, which would be a big improvement. And then we have uses of either dehydrogen as a gas or liquefied, and ammonia. NH3 is ammonia, which are storable and shippable fuels in power system. You know, for example, Japan is looking for imports of blue or green hydrogen as ammonia to put in its power plants. Over a long distance, it's much easier to ship ammonia than to ship hydrogen. Ammonia itself can be used as a fuel directly, and we believe now that it will be the main fuel for deep sea, for the big container ships, tankers, and bulk carriers that consume 85% of the maritime fuels. They will be using ammonia in internal combustion engines, including in existing vessels. Also in industrial furnaces, it's an option. Now you have all the uses of the emerging uses of pure hydrogen in trucks, coaches, buses, for sure. Maybe cars and trains. I'm less convinced. This is an area for discussion. And now for aviation, which also cannot be electrified for any significant in any significant manner. The idea is to make sustainable aviation fuels with biogenic or atmospheric carbon. Why? Because when you do biofuels today, you always have a huge surplus of carbon. So one good way of making this is to add hydrogen, maybe use the oxygen to convert more biomass into gas, and then add hydrogen from this gas and hydrogen to make more synthetic fuel, synthetic kerosene that could replace the fossil-based kerosene in aircrafts. So these are the very important areas. And this will require indeed massive trade, because some countries have much cheaper and much more abundant resources than others in solar and wind. So how to bring that to the countries that have less good resources and very much larger consumption and power density. Our Japanese colleagues have studied that over 5 years, and they have looked at 3 different ways of bringing either blue hydrogen, that is hydrogen from fossil fuels plus carbon dioxide capture and storage, or green hydrogen from renewable energy into Japan. Japan is far away. It's not like Spain and Morocco or Algeria So it's a long trip, and they have been looking at the option of liquid hydrogen. Liquefaction requires lots of energy, organic hydrides, which are costly, and turning the hydrogen into ammonia. And they basically came to the conclusion that ammonia would be the best, first because a big part of the use of hydrogen will be as ammonia, and second, because it can be used directly as a fuel, while for other forms, you would have to extract the hydrogen back on arrival, and this again consumes energy, so it doesn't help. More and more, I'm thinking that pure hydrogen carriers will not fly because if you look at the cost of energy in Europe of imported versus local hydrogen and ammonia, okay, I will stick to that. It's interesting. Let's suppose you have an area where you have electricity, renewable electricity at 30 euros per megawatt hour. I think Baid knows these figures are close to what you have in Morocco nowadays. And in Europe, well, 60 is a better bet on average cost of solar and wind. Of course, solar could be cheaper in the south of Spain, but in the north of Europe, that's the cost you will have, and also the cost you will have with lots of offshore wind that have now achieved this very good level, but still twice as much as in wind power and solar power in Morocco, or maybe in Egypt or other countries. So the cost of ammonia imported will be less than the cost of local ammonia, because a big chunk of this cost here is the cost of electricity. Ammonia is primarily electricity to make, then you have the capex of electrolyzers, then you have the capex of the Haber-Bosch loop, then you have some OPEX, and then you have the transport. Of course, with local, you don't have the transport, but the transport does not make a significant difference. And so on the basis of ammonia will be much cheaper to import than to produce in north of Europe, for example. Now, if you look at ammonia as a carrier for hydrogen, well, then you have to import the ammonia, but then you have to extract the hydrogen from the ammonia. And if you look at the cost of producing hydrogen locally, well, you have twice as much cost of electricity, and you have the capex of electrolyzers, but then that's it. And you end up with a small economic advantage, which will further narrow as we go on, and that the cost of renewable assets gets cheap and electrolyzers gets cheaper. So the economic advantage of importing hydrogen here narrows. It might be different, of course, if you can have pipelines, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me show you just for a second where we are now. We have, when I was at the IEA, and with the help of our IEA consultant, Julien Armigeau, we have modeled the production of hydrogen and ammonia in various places in the world, and in 3 different places in Morocco. And it's interesting to see that here we are at $2.65 per kilogram of hydrogen in Ouarzazate, where there is basically no wind. So it's all based on solar, and the solar in Ouarzazate is very good. That's where Mazen has built this big CSP plant, and now etc. But if you go to Tétouan, where the solar is much less, but the wind is good, then you go down to $2.2 per kilogram. And if you go to Assa, more in the south, where you have excellent solar and excellent wind, you can go down below $2 per kilogram. This suggests that it's important to combine solar and wind as much as you can, because if you try to do things only on wind, it's also true, but less. So only on solar, because of the low capacity factor, you will have a problem with the economics of the electrolyzers, and it's even worse if you add a back-end plant that turn the hydrogen into something else. If you have solar and wind, it's much better, provided the costs are close enough so that you can combine them and increase the capacity factor of the electrolyzers to 50% or so. You don't need to run the electrolyzers around the clock. That's wrong. It's capital intensive, but not to the point that you would need to run them continuously. That's not true. You can run them on variable renewables, but it's good if you can associate solar and wind. And all countries around the Mediterranean are not equal in this respect. And you see here, even in a country like Morocco, you have very big differences in the wind resources. You have to look at all the details, and I will not insist too much, but you have to look at all the detail of the viability of solar and wind on all time scales. This is what we have done. I will not explain the graphs, but it's important to have this thorough assessment of the resource to be able to have a good assessment of the cost of making hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, Fischer-Tropsch, iron. Let me sum up. It's easy. It will be easy to store and ship hydrogen-rich fuels and feedstocks, and so they will be traded based on the cost differences between countries. And that means ammonia in its current and future fuel roles, current industrial feedstock roles and future fuel roles. It's methanol for the chemical industry. It's synthetic hydrocarbon, Fischer-Tropsch fuel for aviations. And it's probably hot briquetted iron, direct reduced iron for steel making. For example, in North Africa, you have iron ores, you have the sun. It would be absurd to export the iron ores to Europe and export the sun in a way as hydrogen to make then steel that we will re-import into Africa, because it's Africa, the big area for new steel. It's more reasonable that Europe helps you technology-wise to develop a green steel-making industry from day one. North Africa still may export hydrogen in pipelines to Europe. That's the difference with the case of Japan. Japan is several thousand kilometers far from Australia, while we're close to each other around the Mediterranean Sea. So there are possibilities for pipelines. It would be interesting to discuss that further. Maybe if we have time in this webinar, we will, but I will stop now. Global decarbonization of industry and long-range transport will require large additional amounts of renewable electricity. And I want to give you just this rough assessment. It's about half to 3/4 of the total electricity generated in 2018 for all purposes that will be needed to decarbonize industry, just the hard to abate sectors in industry and long-range transport. Of course, we need also to have lots more renewable electricity to decarbonize the power sector and to bring electricity to electrify automobile and lots of industrial processes, etc. So this is only to make the hydrogen needed for these harder to electrify, so harder to decarbonize sectors. And this is about 10 times the current electricity from solar and wind. So you see the gap, the big scaling up that is needed to do that at a time where we also, and even I would say, first and foremost, need to decarbonize the power sector. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cedric, for taking us a long way into the area of green gas, of green molecules. I mean, there's been so much discussion in the past of green electrons, and more recently we've seen the kind of sector coupling between green electrons and green gas and the potential for that. I'm seeing a lot of questions still coming in the Q&A box. I would encourage the speakers who have already spoken to maybe take a look at some of those questions and answer some of them in writing in the Q&A box, because we won't have enough time at the end to deal with all the questions. Let me now ask Frank Wouters to introduce himself briefly and then to make his presentation. Frank.
Yes, thanks, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here today on Earth Day. And, you know, about myself, 30 years renewable energy, but since a couple of years focusing also on low carbon hydrogen. I'm the global lead low carbon hydrogen at Worley, one of the largest engineering companies in the world, but I also run a political network that links Europe to the Gulf, the EUGCC Clean Energy Technology Network. And you'll hear something today about the 2 times 40 gigawatt electrolyzer initiative that we started probably a year and a half ago, and we've contributed to with some of the organizations that I'm also involved with. Let me see, how does this work? You'll hear a little bit about energy in Europe, and there will be repetition. I mean, there's no doubt that some of the interesting stuff that the previous speakers have talked about will come back, but that's also good. I mean, you remember from school, your teacher used to say things many times over, so they stick in your head. After Europe, we'll look at the role of hydrogen in the energy transition, the hydrogen economy in North Africa, the potential for export, then very little on the Green Deal, because Sylvia already went into great detail on that. But last, certainly not least, the 2 times 40 gigawatt electrolyzer initiative as part of that Green Deal. And then we will end with what do we have to do. Now let's look at energy in Europe. And I've been, again, working on renewable energy for 30 years. And, we get excited about the fact that for years now, more money has gone into renewable energy investment power than in conventional. Germany, the first quarter, had more than half of its electricity supplied by renewables. But we also have to realize that electricity is only 21% of all final energy. And if we're looking at the overall energy picture in Europe, then 80% of all energy, also for transport and industry, is still carbon-based. That is coal, that is oil and gas. And that is not what we want. So Europe has said we want to be net carbon zero by 2050, which is one of the cornerstones of the Green Deal. And that means, and several speakers have already mentioned that, massive electrification. So we will increase from 20% to at least 50, so 2.5 times the electricity. And that electricity has to be green. But then the main question is, what is the other 50%? If we want to decarbonize transport, we want to decarbonize heavy industry, energy in buildings, and all the stuff where electricity probably will not be the best solution. And this is where hydrogen comes in, because there's very little that can do what hydrogen can do in terms of scalability, in terms of cost competitiveness, but also in terms of universal application. And these are some of the functions that hydrogen can have in the energy transition. Again, it's the twin sister of electricity. And very often people get confused about electricity versus hydrogen, and then they focus on maybe a fuel cell vehicle versus a battery electric vehicle. That is not the main picture. The main picture is that we will massively increase the amount of electricity in the system, and that will be clean. But then what do you do with the other half? And this is where hydrogen comes in. So you can store it loss-free over seasons. You can transport it using the gas grid. So you don't have to build a massive new electricity grids, which we have to do anyway. And you can use it for all the applications that also Cédric already mentioned. And this is where hydrogen has a unique role to play. And these are this is just a very simple graph of how it works. You take renewable electricity, and then there is a central piece of technology, which is called an electrolyzer. And basically what goes into the electrolyzer is electricity, and you split water, which is H2O, into hydrogen, which is H2, and oxygen, which is O2. So that is a very simple piece of equipment called an electrolyzer. But you may also want other products that are based on hydrogen, and Cédric already mentioned ammonia. Ammonia has NH3, so you need the hydrogen from the electrolyzer, but you can also take the nitrogen from air. 82% of air is nitrogen. You can, again, use green electricity to separate air into its components, and then you have nitrogen, you have hydrogen, and you combine that in the Haber-Bosch process to produce ammonia. If the electricity is green, the entire product and chain is green. Now, there is a number of products that are based on green hydrogen that are not entirely carbon-free. For example, jet fuel. If you would like to make synthetic jet fuel, that has aromatic components, it always needs carbon. unless, of course, you design a plane that can run, that can fly on hydrogen or on ammonia. That's also possible, but the current jet engine needs these components. And one of the solutions for that would be to use direct air capture to get CO2 out of the air. Of course, then it's going to be released again when you burn it in the jet engine. But overall, we don't introduce new carbon in the system. So that is one of the things that people are looking at. Now, let's focus on North Africa. North Africa is well endowed with energy. I mean, there's countries that have fossil fuel resources, most notably Algeria, Egypt, and Libya, but others are net importers. They don't have substantial amounts of it, so that they're importing energy, and that's Morocco, Tunisia, and others. And but at the same time, they're well endowed with very, very good renewable resources. We've seen that. Obaid and Cedric already mentioned that, and Irina recently estimated that until 2030, so in the next 10 years, there's already feasible potential for 120 gigawatts. The large majority is wind, but of course also solar. You may wonder who is going to benefit. Is it going to be the ones that are able to now also produce renewable fuels and molecules and export them? Yes, of course, that would be new business, using, for example, Morocco's Atlantic winds and solar resource. But also the existing hydrocarbon exporters, they already have the infrastructure. For Algeria to drop in hydrogen and send that to Europe using existing pipes is an opportunity, and the same is for Libya. So they have the infrastructure, they have the physical and intellectual capacity to do that. So there is nothing that would be against that. Now let's look at Morocco, and ammonia has been mentioned several times. OCP is a 100-year-old Moroccan champion. It's one of the globally leading companies, exporters of phosphate-based fertilizers. The issue is that they currently buy ammonia on the world market. Ammonia is typically made from natural gas or from coal. They don't have that, so they have to buy it. And that's a million tons per year. And at a cost of a few $100s per ton, you're looking at several $100 million every year that Morocco has to pay to buy ammonia to make the fertilizer. And that you can actually produce locally using the resource. These are some of the numbers. If they were to choose to replace 60% of their demand, they would need to build roughly 900 megawatts of solar and wind. It depends a bit on the location, as Cedric already showed how that differs on where the resource is. But roughly, you're looking at a capex bill, an investment bill for the ammonia synthesis process, the electrolyzers, and the renewable energy capacity between 2 and 3 billion. It's a big number, but you need the scale to get to a cost point where it's interesting and where you can actually compete with the alternative. And then once you've done that, once you have built an industry, once you have built a capacity to produce, you can then also look at selling this abroad. And the market, we've seen that, it's Europe. There's various pathways, Cedric already mentioned. On top, it's the ammonia pathway. Ammonia is a worldwide traded commodity. So there is vessels for that, there is tanks, there's infrastructure for that. So using that to ship green ammonia across the planet is something that is very easy to do. But the lowest cost is actually using the gas grid. So you make hydrogen and you use a gas pipe. There is an estimation that if you would do that at scale, it would add 0.2 euro or dollars per kilo of hydrogen at production cost of maybe 1.5. That is not the end of the world. So actually using a gas pipe to transport energy over longer distances is very, very cost effective. The bottom line would be liquefaction. So you can also make liquid hydrogen. It costs a lot of money to invest in liquefaction plants, but it enables you to basically ship very pure hydrogen to an end consumer anywhere on the planet. Recently, Japan launched the first vessel to do that, to take liquid hydrogen from Australia to Japan. Let's see what what this would mean for the trade relationship between North Africa and Europe. But connecting the gas grid, again, is the lowest hanging fruit. And if you do the numbers, you know, 2 pipelines of 40-inch each would have the same capacity as the Nord Stream gas pipeline that takes Russian gas to Europe. And to put that into perspective, 300 terawatt hours per year, that is half Germany's electricity demand per year. So you can actually, in 2 pipes, you can transport as much energy as half of Germany consumes of electricity in a year. So that is a massive amount. And it's also a great opportunity to earn revenue at $1.50 per kilo. That would be more than $11 billion per year. The Green Deal, I'm not going to repeat what Sylvia already said. I think it's important to understand it's not an energy program. It's also not a climate policy. It's more than that. It's basically an attempt to build a new economy where economic growth is disconnected from emissions. And it's also, you know, inclusive, just and fair, and all of the social aspects that are sometimes forgotten. But there's a number of things to consider. One is that 100% energy independence doesn't seem feasible in Europe. So if we want to have in Europe a 100% decarbonized energy system, the space is just not there for the offshore wind turbines and the solar panels that you need to make that work. So there is an element of import. Energy independence does not seem to be feasible. And here comes the electrolyzer initiative. We had the opportunity to discuss this with Executive Vice President Timmermans a few times now. And this was a picture we took in November last year in Brussels, but we had a meeting 2 weeks ago on the same topic. And the idea is to get to a cost price which is competitive. And to do that, you need scale. So you need to build electrolyzers. You need to get to a certain volume, because electrolyzer equipment, like a solar panel, like a wind turbine, the more you make them, the cheaper they get. It's the same with your mobile phone. It's the same with your TV. TVs are now a lot cheaper than they were 10 years ago, as you probably all know. And the same is going to be the case for electrolyzers. At the moment, nobody makes them. We have to get to scale to be cost competitive. And this is one of the ideas to do that, is to create a market of 2 times 40 gigawatts inside Europe and 40 gigawatts in the Ukraine and in North Africa. And the aim is to get to 1.5 to 2 euro per kilo by 2025, and even 1 to 1.5 by 2030. There is going to be creation of jobs up to 170,000. Of course, we're going to reduce emissions. And if we're then looking at what it means for North Africa and the Ukraine, and again, these are first indications and options. They now have to be further discussed and elaborated. But the idea is that, you know, there would be, of course, first to cover domestic demand. And we've seen the example of ammonia, but that should also be you know, green steel. It should be the balancing of the electricity grid. All the countries will do that first, because that just makes sense. But beyond that, there is an opportunity for export, and that is where a large chunk of the capacity would go, because Europe actually needs the hydrogen. I mean, that's the bottom line. And if you have the ability to make that cost competitively, then that could be an opportunity for you. Now, what needs to be done? Because these are all nice words on a PowerPoint. What do we need to do to make this work? And I think it's important because many questions have also referred to the Desertec initiative or the Desertec industrial initiative. And there is some learnings there. I think we have to realize the complexity of something like this between countries and regions. So you need to engage in a dialogue first and foremost. And then you need to recognize that you're talking about not just a technology, it's not just about trade, but you're also talking about political, societal, and economic aspects of a big change that you're going to start to make. Secondly, market. You need to work on the design of a market. At the moment, there is no market for green hydrogen, so that needs some thought. We still need money to spend on innovation and research and development, so that needs consideration. We need to work on market. There is at the moment, we also have to realize that there is still a price gap. We cannot produce hydrogen right now that is competitive with gray or other hydrogen. So you need to find a mechanism to close the gap. And one of those mechanisms could be EU auctions, like we're auctioning renewable electricity right now. You could do the same, let's say, offshore wind. I want 1,000 megawatts of offshore wind, produce electricity, but also produce hydrogen that could be prescribed in that auction. The financial sector needs to be involved, informed and engaged. We need to work on regulation standards. At the moment, there is a big gap. We need to look at access to infrastructure. We need to also look at how to potentially convert the existing gas grid. And then one of the technical important elements is that hydrogen can be stored over the season. So it enables you to work with variable renewable electricity, store it in salt caverns. But what is the business mechanism for that? How does that work? Who's going to make those investments? Who's going to recoup those investments? All of those questions need to be addressed. Thank you very much.
Frank, thank you very much for a great summary of those opportunities. We've just been told that we can extend by about 10 minutes or so because there's just so many questions coming in. So let's start with the questions. I'm going to pose first one question to all of the panelists, and if you could maybe answer in the order in which you actually made your presentation. And it's a question that seems to be coming up again and again in the QA box, which is essentially when we're in the after COVID-19 recovery period, whether it's in North Africa or Eastern Mediterranean or in Europe, will green energy and the Green Deal and all those things, will they be still a high priority for policymakers, or will it somehow go further down the list of priorities than it was before? That's a question that I think is on the minds of a lot of people. So let me ask Sylvia first to give a brief response, and then Obaid, and then Cedric, and then Frank. Sylvia.
I think I have my Frank, please, can you remove your screen as well? He's still sharing. Well, given the question, I thought I had kind of answered in my presentation, and probably I was not clear then. But I think the whole idea by making the COVID recovery package, the stimulus package, consistent with the green transition is to avoid that. And I'm not specifically talking about hydrogen, but some examples that are going around. When you bail out industries that are collapsing, you could make some conditions, for instance, that you don't put back into operation highly carbon intensive facilities, that you make sure only the old cars are scrapped, and I don't know what you do with planes, which is probably the most difficult one, but the whole point is try to make this recovery good from the beginning. As I said before, the GDP will fall, energy demand will fall. What falls most are the fossil fuels. If you don't let those plants, because the lowest marginal cost is for renewables, so they will continue running in priority. So if you ensure then when you have the recovery, you don't put in operation a coal plant if it stops running, normally you have a win-win situation. You have a double win, and you can have a recovery that is compatible with your green objectives. I think I'll stop here, otherwise I'll talk all the time.
Okay, thank you. Obaid, your turn.
It is a very tough question. At least for Morocco, I don't think that's something will change because the objectives have been have been fixed to reach 52% of the capacity by 2013, and there are a set of projects that are under the go. And I don't think, and it is absolutely not possible that we come back on those objectives. I think that it will be more easier for market parity technology and market energy parity, renewable energy parity that are near the market to go well. For the others, perhaps we will need more work and to make this renewable energy a kind of new fuel for the recovery of the economies. And this is why we need some lobbying about those aspects to maintain the dynamics and to accelerate it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Cedric, so will green energy be the priority of governments and economies when we're in the COVID-19 recovery period, or will it go further down the agenda? Very general question. What do you think?
Well, I think not all governments will have the same stand on that. We're seeing the president of a big nation state ready to bail out its huge shale gas and oil companies because they are suffering from the glut of oil now, and that would just be a disaster, giving enormous amount of taxpayers' money to increase the carbon content of our energy mix. And you see a number of other governments ready to seize the opportunity of the economic stimulus to direct it to an energy transition, which is a way to make the change that, of course, never appears as urgent as a pandemia, but is in fact urgent in the sense that it will take us several decades to change course in depth. And so we better start now, because otherwise we'll have big damages which have already started, which will only get worse as we go on. And from this, I would say maybe what's more important is what people will feel. And I see two opposite lessons that could be taken. For some, the big economic shock of the lockdown of the population and therefore of the economies will have a number of disastrous effects on the poor of the poor, right? On the bottom of the pyramid, now in our countries, but maybe in the coming months in the developing world. It has not happened yet, maybe it will not, but there is a definitive risk, and the disaster can be considerable, as it is already in some of our suburbs or for some of the populations in the US and in Europe. So this big economic shock could lead to an appetite for growth as being the only way to pay the debts, to recover, to make the economy good, etc., using this very bad metrics that is a national gross product, etc. That's one possible way. The opposite way would be that people get a better knowledge of what really matters in their lives. That is, of course, health, wealth in the sense of food, of minimum comfort, minimum hygiene, etc. But finally, traveling the world 4 times a year for 1 week vacation at 5,000 kilometers far away is not that needed. Replacing its smartphone every year to get to the to the very novel novelties and with a more pixel on the camera in the back of your smartphone is not that important, and we can try to fix the one we bought 2 years or 3 years ago, or have it repaired and recycled, etc., etc. And this, of course, also goes with taking care of the people who will be badly hit by the economic shock of the lockdown. So it's not possible to have this if you don't have more solidarity between populations, between social classes in each and every country, but also in the world between countries. It shows more than ever that what we already had discovered in France, for example, with the yellow vests, is that only the transition to the energy and ecology transitions needs to be just, or it won't happen. And I think the Commission with the Just Transition Fund that will aim at avoiding the social consequences of the eradication of coal in some countries, etc., has understood that. And I certainly hope that all the European governments and others in the world will also get to this point. But it's primarily a problem of conscience by the citizens. And then it's for them in most countries to decide the course being followed by the nation. Thank you for the opportunity to express this.
Cedric, I think you make some really good points. I mean, so many things there are so many factors and so many things are changing so fast. I mean, economic, political, psychological, you know, what people want in their lives, what they'll want in the future. It's really impossible to predict anything at this stage, but it is possible to identify what the important factors are and which ones could be changing and in which direction they could be changing. And I think one very clear thing about this period right now is that there's a lot of interest, a lot of appetite amongst people to discuss these issues and to debate these issues and to talk about things that perhaps in past years, perhaps they were too busy to spend much time talking about them and so on, or they weren't kind of forced to reflect on them. Well, one thing about the lockdown is even if we're all still busy in various ways, it pushes us to reflect on things that perhaps we weren't reflecting on so much before. Frank, do you want to contribute?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, somebody said, you don't like this, you should try climate change. You know, one of the interesting piece of information I read today was that you know, there was a global survey done among you know, people in many countries. 65% on global average of people expressed the desire to include environmental considerations in economic stimulus. In China, that was even 80%. In the United States, 57%. But you know, it just shows that this is something that people really support. And what is also telling was when you know, the first talk about economic stimulus surfaced in the European Union, the Czech Republic and Poland said, oh, we should you know, delay the Green Deal, and you know, we don't have money for that right now, just build the economy. And that actually backfired. So there was a note from the European Council to the European Commission in which there was no mention of the Green Deal talking about the economic stimulus package, but after they raised it, it was actually included. So then the European Council, which is, you know, the heads of state, told the European Commission to go and do their work and work on an economic stimulus package, specifically looking at the Green Deal. So, I mean, you see that, and as Cedric said, you know, it will differ in countries, but I think it's important to recognize that people actually want this. The large majority of the global population wants this, despite, you know, what's happening maybe across the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think sometimes people worry too much about what's happening across the Atlantic Ocean from where you're sitting. I mean, if the if US politics go in a certain direction, well, that's one thing, but doesn't mean everybody else in the world has to worry too much about that necessarily. We all kind of have a bit of a habit of worrying a lot about that, and maybe that's for more historical reasons than for today's reasons. I think also we often still talk as if there's some trade-off between things economic and things environmental, because with clean energy in the past, until a few years ago, you couldn't really have both. The clean energy was more expensive, and you just decide, do you want to pay more for the environmental benefits? But for the past few years, as we all know, often clean energy is the cheaper alternative, and getting cheaper all the time. So when it comes to the COVID-19 recovery period and stimulus packages and so on, in many cases, stimulating the cleaner energy alternatives will just be the cheaper and more efficient thing to do. And if that means stimulating it in the countries where the resource is best, like with solar and in some cases wind in the southern and eastern Mediterranean, then a Europe that's in an economic depression, if it wants to pull out of the depression as fast as possible, then getting the cheapest energy available, even if it's the other side of the Mediterranean, may just be in the pure economic self-interest of Europe. It also may be in the political interest of Europe, because I think what Europe has learned in the last few years is that having economic welfare, growth, political stability in the southern and eastern Mediterranean is good for Europe, or would be good for Europe. And reaching out and buying energy where it's cheapest across the Mediterranean for Europe may really be in the purest self-interest, as well as having all the environmental and climate change benefits. I think probably at this point, I've had the last word, because we've sort of run out of time, more than run out of time. Thank you to our great panelists for their interventions. Thank you to our very many participants for joining us, and for the great questions that we had, only some of which we managed to answer. Maybe the panelists would be willing to take up some of the other questions bilaterally. But thank you to everybody for a very lively participation, and a topic that has obviously aroused a huge amount of interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.